Good to know. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. Hello, people on Zoom. Those of you who are on Zoom, you will know that I am not Rabbi Bonnie Capel, but we're using her computer. That's why it says that. I am Rabbi Scott Segal. I am the husband of Rabbi Emily Segal. And I'm also someone who has spent a lot of time studying the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, working in that field. Even before my time in rabbinical school in the rabbinate, I spent a lot of time in this arena, including the 2 years of what's generally called the Second Intifada, working for the Israeli consulate in San Francisco, which is essentially working for the foreign ministry, doing what's called hasbara, which is public relations. And in a lot of ways, it was a very similar time to kind of what we're experiencing now in terms of attitudes towards Israel, particularly on campuses and things like that. But this part of the reason that we wanted to do this and that I was excited to do these kinds of sessions is because there is so much information that's out there. It's hard to know it's hard to make sense of it all. It's hard to understand which things are worth paying attention to, which things are not. How do we discern what's legit, what's not? There's a lot of different people saying a lot of different things, a lot of different perspectives. And if we want to try and have thoughtful conversations about this topic, then it necessitates at least attempting to have kind of like a baseline, at least, of shared, accepted information. And now, that shared, accepted information may not be thought of as such by other groups, but at least for us within our community, it gives us the opportunity to kind of try and get on a similar wavelength, so that then we can at least have thoughtful, nuanced conversations about a very difficult and complicated topic. As we're getting started, just a couple of little points that I want to make sure I emphasize, just in terms of the general sense and structure of the class. One is that while I try very hard to remove any biases I have out of what I'm teaching. I can't remove them entirely because I'm a human and that's impossible. But I do try very hard to be conscious of my own biases and to kind of mitigate that in whatever ways I can. Part of how I go about doing that is by trying, when I can, to present perspectives that are in conflict with my own, or in conflict with what I've kind of understood to be the accepted history of the conflict, which in certain cases means bringing in or acknowledging perspectives that I don't agree with or I don't necessarily think are correct, but it gives us that opportunity to at least understand where a difference, where the Palestinian Arab side is coming from, and not because we need to agree with it or even legitimize it in some cases, but at least to know, so we can say, this is why, we can kind of get a sense of why they have that perspective, and then take it from there. We all are very careful about not demonizing anyone. All right, I don't have any tolerance for anti-Israel rhetoric, for anti-Arab rhetoric. That doesn't help anything. That doesn't move the conversation forward in any way, and it's just unnecessary. And
what do you want?
No need. By the way, someone I think is not muted, just FYI. So, and I'd say it goes without saying, but then I'm going to say it. So, we all need to make sure that we're being respectful of each other, respectful of the topic, because it is a difficult topic emotionally, intellectually. It is something that takes a lot of it takes a lot of effort to really approach it from as kind of a level-headed perspective as possible, because it is a topic that we feel very passionately about, and particularly in this environment, in the environment that we're in terms of, with all the kind of anti-Israel rhetoric that we're hearing, with all the kind of the difficulties that we are encountering as a Jewish community right now. It is easy to kind of get way up in our feelings about it, but in this particular setting, I want us to try and not do that too much, at least. My goal with this is not for everyone to agree with everything, or to agree with each other, or to convince anyone of any particular point of view or anything like that. My goal with this, and the congregation's goal with this, is to try and give us as much kind of information as possible that we can then take and mold it into whatever point of view that we think the facts give us. So that is my goal, is to kind of provide the information. I will certainly give my points of view on things, but I will try and emphasize that they are mine and mine alone. But my goal is to try and put out the info, and then for your job is to take it and kind of mull it over and consider it and decide what you think about it, and challenge it if necessary, and do with it what you will. In terms of sources that I'm going to be using, or that I have used in preparation for this, they are almost entirely English language sources. So, there's that caveat. I try to draw from a decently wide spectrum of kind of academic or intellectual approaches to this topic, in order to try and ensure that I'm presenting as broad an understanding of this as possible. Any attempt to there is no way to kind of teach everything about this topic, no matter how much time you give to it. It is deep, it is complicated, and it is, because so many people have written about it and so many people have kind of discussed it and spent time learning it and studying it and teaching it. There are 1,001 voices speaking on this topic, and part of my job in preparation for this is to try and sift through and find the voices that are most, I hesitate to use the word legitimate, but for lack of a better one, people who have proven over time to be thoughtful and careful students of and teachers of this topic. And so, all right, so the general, so this is a 3-part deal. Today, the plan is to do essentially the pre-48 stuff. And then depending on time, we may get into the 48 war, but we'll just have to see how the timing goes. And then next week will be essentially 1948, kind of up to and through the Oslo Accords. And then the third session will be from the Oslo Accords until today. And so, and I was saying this to you guys before, I love teaching this session in particular because it's the one where people tend to have the least amount of experience, and have spent the least amount of time looking at it. And it is the things that we're going to talk about, the experiences that we're going to talk about, are ones that people are least likely to have lived through. Next week when we start, especially when we get into 67, 73 and beyond, there were a lot of people who saw that happen in real time. A lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, people did not necessarily see happen in real time. And it is, to me, these moments that we're going to talk about are so important to understanding why we are where we are today. It's, studying the conflict without understanding the pre-48 experience in the land of Israel, or in what was known as Palestine, to me is building a house without a foundation, because everything that has happened post 48 is kind of built upon the experiences of the Jews and Arabs living in the land of Israel, living in Palestine before that. So, I want to start, the first moment that I really want to talk about is the Balfour Declaration, right? That's 1917. So what's just a little bit of kind of lead into that. Zionism had already been a movement, a flourishing movement for certainly probably like 30 to 40 years at that point. Jews had already been coming to Palestine for decades by then. There were settlements, there were communities. It was the process had already begun, the process of establishing a Jewish state in the land of Israel and in what was known as Palestine. That was well on its way to happening. And in the aftermath of World War I, we get the Balfour Declaration, which was Britain. So prior to World War I, this area known as Palestine was occupied by the Ottoman Turks. And then they lost that war, and the British took over. And I think it was the Pico-Sykes Agreement, where the British and the French basically sliced and diced the entire Middle East. And they took a little piece here, a little piece there, a little piece there. The issues of that are for a different day. That's a whole different topic to consider. But Britain ended up with Palestine. And after much lobbying from the Jewish community of England and Europe, we had the Balfour Declaration, which essentially says that the British are in favor of establishing a Jewish home in the area known as Palestine, in the land of Israel. And that was huge. That was a massive, massive occurrence, because it was the first time that there was any legitimacy given to this enterprise, to the Zionist enterprise, outside of the Zionists themselves. This was the first kind of real state acknowledgement of the legitimacy of this plan. And certainly, in that moment, England was, they were one of the major power players in the world. And so to have them supporting this was huge. And it provided a lot of optimism for the Jews at that time. We know, at least in some degree, what happened. It did not go quite as smoothly as everyone might have hoped. But there we are. So a couple of things in the lead up to Balfour itself. So as I said, Jews had been coming to Palestine already for a number of years. And we immediately, almost from the jump, start to see tension between the Jewish and Arab communities in that area, which is entirely understandable. In fact, it would be shocking if that hadn't happened. And one of the issues, which is one that we still are seeing today, is that the Jews viewed themselves as returning, that they were coming home, that they were coming back to a place that they had been exiled from, that they had never forgotten about, that they had always longed for. And so they were coming home. This was their home that they were finally able to come back to. But the Arab population was essentially like, who are these friggin' guys? Like, we don't know these people. We have no reason to, there was no sense among the Arab population that this was a homecoming for the Jews, because that just wasn't in their purview. All they saw were Europeans coming to their land and setting up shop. And to them, it didn't, nothing else mattered beyond them. The Jews who were coming also didn't really do a great job initially of engaging with the Arab population in a meaningful way. There's a quote from like, I think it's 1914 from a man named Hakai Be al-Azam. He says, "We see Jews excluding themselves completely from Arabs in language, school, commerce, custom, their entire economic life. Hence, the Arab population considers them a foreign race." So it wasn't simply that they were people coming from another country and settling in Palestine. It was that they were doing so seemingly without any attempt to kind of make themselves a part of the existing culture, community, economy, etc.
Rabbi, can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So European Jews came back to the land, but were Jews from the surrounding, like from Syria or, the neighboring nations where Jews had lived, were they also at this point coming back?
Not really. Zionism for really, predominantly until we get pretty close to 48, and then, in the decade afterwards, Zionism was primarily a European movement. And so we don't see like the Mizrahim and the other Jews living in Arab countries making any kind of significant movement to come to the land of Israel at the time. And in fact, they may not have had much sense that there was this kind of movement happening at all, because it was very European-centric. So, as one might expect, as the Jewish community starts to grow and coalesce and establish institutions, establish schools, establish businesses, establish kind of political, or political and economic systems, the Arab community of Palestine starts to feel a little skeeved out by this, in part because at that moment there wasn't much of an organized kind of Arab nationalist push. There were elements of it, there were little smatterings here and there, but there wasn't kind of a systemic attempt to create a kind of a national entity. And so in some ways, the Zionists coming kind of sparked that, and yes, in part as a response to the Zionists, but also in some ways it was people seeing what the Jews were doing and being like, hey, you know what? That's a really good idea, and we can do that too. So we should try and do that. And so kind of inspired by is pushing it, but maybe motivated by what they saw from the kind of the Zionist organizations and the way they were going about setting things up. People in the Palestinian Arabs at that time started to think, okay, there's no reason we can't do this too. And pretty quickly, there was an understanding on both sides that there were going to be issues, like that this was the idea of one land for two people was inherently problematic, and it was acknowledged as such from a very, very early time. And so a guy named Yitzhak Epstein, in a lecture called "The Hidden Question" in 1907, as early as 1907, He said, among the difficult questions, there is one which is equal to all others, the question of our relations with the Arabs. We have forgotten one small matter. There is in our beloved land an entire nation, which has occupied it for hundreds of years and has never thought to leave it. The Arab, like every man, is tied to his native land with strong bonds. And this guy actually thought that the Zionists should get the consent of the Arab community before doing any of the things that they were doing, and that they should really open their schools, their hospitals, their libraries, businesses, whatever, to the Arabs as much as they were open to the Jews. Now, on the flip side, we have an opinion of a guy named Moshe Smelansky, who said, either the land of Israel belongs in the national sense to those Arabs who settled there in recent times, and then we have no place there, and we must say explicitly, the land of our fathers is lost to us. Or, if the land of Israel belongs to us, to the Jewish people, then our interests come before all else. It is not possible for one country to serve as the homeland of two peoples. All right, so this is not, and that's 1908. So again, like really early on, we are already seeing that there is an understanding that this is an issue that's going to have to be addressed. This is something that's going to have to be dealt with. So one of the great challenges of studying this topic is the fact that we have essentially dual narratives happening, parallel narratives. We have the Jewish narrative and the Arab narrative, right? And when we think of these things, we tend to think of, well, it either has to be one or the other. But part of what makes this so complicated and so interesting, quite frankly, is that in a lot of cases, this is one of my favorite lines in Fiddler on the Roof is, Tevye's, there's a group of people gathered around and, they're all arguing whatever. And one guy says one thing and Tevye says, yes, you're right. And another guy says like the opposite thing and Tevye says, yes, you're right. And someone says, well, he says this, he's right and he's right. They can't both be right. And he says, you know what? You are also right. And this is kind of one of those times. And I want to give you an example of this that I think illustrates it really well. So in the kind of Jewish historical understanding of the building of the land of Israel, Jews came in and purchased land from the people who owned that land, and then built their towns, their cities, whatever, on that land that had been purchased, bought and paid for, legitimately. What we often hear from the Palestinian narrative is that the land was stolen. Like the Jews came in and took the land. It wasn't theirs to take, and they came in and they took it, either by force or by kind of conniving or whatever the case may be. So, and here's where the kind of crossover happens. So in a lot of cases, when Jews were buying these large tracts of land, they were buying them from absentee landowners, people who did not actually live on that land. They owned the land, but then that land was kind of rented out to tenants who farmed it, who lived on it, whatever. And so if you are, and when, once the Jews bought this land, those tenants were told they need to leave. But if you're one of those tenants, all you know is that the Jews came and kicked you off your spot. And so you have this situation where you could see how both sides can kind of be right at the same time. Like, yes, the Jews bought the land, it was legit, there's all sorts of evidence to support that. But at the same time, if you're the Palestinians saying, well, no, like they kicked us off the land, you can see why they would have that perspective, because for the vast majority of the people on the land itself, that was their experience. They didn't know from, that some rich guy living, in Lebanon or something like that, or living somewhere else had sold this land. I'm sure the person didn't, come by and like knock on the door and be like, hey, so sorry, I sold this land to the Jews who are coming in. So, you got 30 days and then you got to, get on out of here. I feel quite certain that what happened was that the land was sold. The Jews basically, hey, so we own this land now, and we kind of want to use it for ourselves, so you got to go. But then the problem is, like, you have these narratives that kind of branch off each other, with neither one ever really kind of understanding the other. And so, you have the Jewish community saying, that's ridiculous. Of course, we bought the land. It's, we have all sorts of, we got the receipts, what do you want? And then the Palestinians saying, no, it was a crime. We were kicked off. It was, we were pushed off the land by force and all that other kind of stuff. And that, all of this kind of just builds the challenge of trying to like have even the most basic conversation about this, because we've been told two entirely different stories that both have legitimacy. It would be really easy if one of them was completely bogus, but it's not. And we can kind of see why that perspective would be there. Even if we can say, well, that's not factually true, it's not hard to understand why that narrative exists. So, over the time leading up to and through the Balfour Declaration, there was growing tension because you had two very different cultures, communities, religions trying to exist in this space and kind of jockeying for position in a lot of ways. And the Jews, like I said before, they did not exactly go out of their way to kind of make themselves a part of the larger community. But at the same time, the Arabs of Palestine were not exactly, jumping up and down to welcome the Jews in either. And so, this tension, starts at already a pretty high level and then just grows and grows and grows. So from the Palestinian Arab perspective, the Balfour Declaration itself was immediately problematic. And the reasons for it, and this is, like I said before, it's important to me to kind of bring that perspective in just so we know what it is, so we can understand like why they've had some of the thoughts and feelings that they've had about this. So the Arabs of Palestine viewed the Balfour Declaration as illegitimate and problematic for a bunch of reasons, but a few of the main ones. One, Britain granted a land it did not possess to a group who did not own it at the expense of those who possessed and had the right to it. So from the perspective of the Arabs, like, it was not Britain's to give, and yet they gave it. It's kind of like if you let someone borrow something and then you go to get it back from them, and they're like, oh yeah, I gave it to this other person. You're like, well, dude, that's not yours. It's not yours to give out to someone else. And that's how the Arabs of Palestine felt about this. It's like, okay, Britain, we get it. You're kind of overseeing this right now, but it's not yours, and it wasn't your right to offer it to somebody else. They viewed it as a blatant aggression against the rights of Palestinian Arabs to dependence on its own land. I mean, there was a very agricultural society at the time, and so giving land away, essentially, the way it was seen, the British giving land to the Jews was depriving people of their livelihood. And it ignored the rights of the Arabs, who were by far the majority. So we can understand why people would feel salty about this, like why there would be anger, why there would be inherent mistrust, not only of the British, but of the Jews, who were viewed as being, linked very closely with the British, regardless of what the actual relationship between the Jews and the British was. All right, so getting into the 1920s. So, Balfour Declaration is a few years old now. The process of immigration is continuing on. We're seeing the emergence of Jewish towns and cities and infrastructure and all these other things. And in the 20s, it's where we start to see real kind of physical conflict start to come into play. There were kind of little skirmishes here and there, but nothing really significant that happened until we get into the 20s. And the first moment that I want to point to is what are called the Jaffa riots of 1921. So interestingly, these riots actually started off as a clash between two Jewish groups. And what to me makes it even more bizarre is that it was a clash between a group of Jewish communists and a group of Jewish socialists who had competing May Day celebrations going on. And they ended up getting into some sort of altercation, fisticuffs, whatever we want to call it. And then this ended up kind of spilling out and inciting a bunch of attacks by the Arab community against the Jews. And the exact match that lit that flame is a little bit unclear. The sources aren't entirely sure what exactly got the Arab community involved in this, but there was essentially a riot of Arabs in the area who went about beating and stabbing a whole bunch of Jewish people. One particular kind of piece of this, which I think highlights some of the tensions that existed at the time. There was an immigrant hostel that was attacked by the Arabs, and at the time it hosted I think the sources I looked at said somewhere between like 80 and 100 relatively new immigrants to the land, most of whom were from Eastern Europe. And so because it was a place that hosted new immigrants, it was viewed as a Zionist stronghold. But also, and this kind of speaks to the culture clashes, it was viewed as a den of iniquity. And so this is a quote from one of a Palestinian Arab source about what was going on. So it says, sometimes the young men and women living at the hostel would walk down to the beach with their arms around each other, and the locals said they were polluting Arab morality. So, this different understanding of what constitutes an appropriate interaction between men and women that, adds to the issues at play. And again, this is part of the culture clash that, further inflames the political, the religious, the territorial, and everything else. Now, one of the things that was really key in the aftermath of the Jaffa riots was this is where we get the establishment of the Haganah. And the Haganah was kind of the original defense mechanism for the Jews of Palestine. And so in response to these riots, in response to the kind of beatings and destructions, it was a lot of the people who were there at the time kind of looked at it in the same way as they would have looked at a pogrom. Right? It hit some of those same notes. And so in the aftermath of that, it was decided amongst those in the leadership that the Jews needed a way to protect themselves without having to rely on the British, because the British were, not exactly, jumping up and down to try and, get in between, an Arab mob and the Jews. So after 1921, we actually get a weird stretch, an unexpected stretch of quiet. For about 7 or 8 years, things are relatively stable. But that doesn't mean that there's not still issues. The tension is still growing because as the Jews continue to build and establish themselves, they are perceived as a larger and larger threat to the Arab majority living in the land. And we see kind of continued issues in terms of culture, in terms of religion, in terms of economics. Just everything becomes an issue. it starts to turn into one of those situations where there's maybe initially there might have been areas where there were compromise or where there was overlap, but as time goes on, those become fewer and fewer, in part because the Jews really are focused on doing their thing. And also just because it's two very different groups of people with very different ideas about how to go about doing stuff. I'm gonna pause there for a second. Questions or anything else up to this point? So I know I'm throwing a lot of information at y'all, but that's just kind of how it goes. Yeah.
One of the things that I had read or heard or seen was when Britain first decided to allocate Palestine, that they had actually gone to the Arabs and to the Jews who were in Palestine during World War I. If they said, if you fight for us, we'll give you the land. And they said to the other party, if you fight for us, we'll give you the land. And then sure enough, Britain won. And then that's what created that initial, unevenness.
Yeah, I mean,
is that true that happened?
Well, so I'll put it this way. I don't know if that officially happened, but that probably happened. The British and the French were not known, particularly back then, for being especially forthcoming, maybe with non-British people or non-French people. I think there was an inherent discrimination or inherent kind of looking down upon both Jews and Arabs. And so if there were an opportunity for them to use those two groups to better their own fortunes, I think it's a safe assumption that they would have done that. Whether they actually did that or not, I'm not 100% sure, but it tracks.
With the fall of Turkey and Britain gets a hold of that land, what land law did it fall under? Turkish, British? When they sold property, was it under Turkish land laws or British?
I mean, when the Turks were in charge, it was under Turkish, and when
But afterwards,
it would have been under, I believe it would have been under British law. I mean, it would have shifted to being under British law. I don't know enough about
so
the property
and the
laws.
people that were there under Turkish rules no longer had their land, or did Britain respect the rules of the landlords of the time period that got their land from Turkey under their documentation?
Oh, I don't think there was a situation where the British kind of went in and said, okay, it's a free for all. Everyone, if you bought your land under the Turks, you now, too bad, so sad. I don't think they were coming in and removing or kind of like, or suspending land ownership or anything like that until they could decide what the laws were. I think, people who owned the land under the Turks, that land remained theirs under the British, unless they chose to sell it afterwards.
It's sort of like the Turks were administering the land and then the British were administering.
Right, no one, yeah, I mean, like, it
Like
was,
switching banks.
it's like in
JNF
any,
started buying land.
sorry, what now?
So when the JNF and organizations start buying land, they're buying still land that was owned by absentee landlords.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that the Turks owned the land or the British owned the land. I mean, they were conquerors. And so they, were the kind of overseeing or, occupying government of that space. But the landowners themselves were, whoever they were. And, in a lot of cases, it was people, I'm sure there were a number of people who were Turkish, plenty of Arabs who owned, large areas of land there. I don't think prior to World War I, there was going to be a whole lot of, for lack of a better term, a whole lot of white people owning stuff there. But I think, the specific kind of demographics of the ownership is not something that I have a lot of details on. But the owners of the kind of was overseeing the land writ large were two separate, kind of separate stratas.
I have a question. You said that there was an understanding as early as 1907 or 1908 that Arabs and Jews couldn't really coexist in the land. Why? Was that based on, was there racism from European Jews, anti-Semitism from Arabs? Is it just the cultures were so different? The Jews were more insular, the Arabs were more insular. Is there sort of
Yes.
cultural? Yeah, so it's like all of it.
I mean, there's a lot of different factors that went into it. One is, I think, and I know right now, the idea of, the Jews as colonialists is kind of cropped back up again. And, they weren't, because like, as I think we all know, like Jews lived in that land, for a long, long, long time before we were kicked out of it. So in that sense, we were not colonialists because we were coming back to a place that had belonged to us. However, some of the ways in which the Jews went about doing things had a colonial bent to them. The attitude they took towards the Arabs sometimes had kind of a colonial bent to it. I mean, not in every case, but in a lot of cases, they looked down on the Arabs. They viewed words, you see a lot of use of terms like savages and things like that. So, I mean, there was definitely a lot of kind of built-in anti-Arab sentiment. And I think on the flip side, there was some built-in anti-Semitism, although I think in that case, it was less about them being Jews specifically than just being people who the Arabs thought didn't belong there. They didn't recognize
on their door and said, "We live here now."
Right, like they didn't recognize that this was people coming back to something. All they saw was like, okay, you're Russian and now you're here, so what gives?
So at this time, Rabbi Scott, the Arabs that are in this area, we know that Turkey or Ottoman Empire had this, and then it was British. But these Arabs themselves are not part of any Arab state. There's no Palestinian state. Jordan is not there. Egypt is part of Gaza Strip. That none of that exists. These are just people who happen to be there. There's no government, but they've been raided and owned by the Ottoman Empire and then the British, and they just happen to live on this land, right? Like they're not organized as a structure.
Part of the
I mean, it was, my understanding is that it was more tribal. I mean, if you think of like, if you want something that might be a kind of a familiar like picture, is like you think of like a Bedouin tribe. There was some of that. I mean, it was very agrarian, so there was people farmed and had raised animals and things like that. But not just with Palestine, but the whole Middle East. We have to remember, like the Middle East as we know it today was not split up in that way.
Right.
Up into that was not until the 20th century, and so there wasn't a sense of what one thing that is true is there wasn't necessarily a sense from the jump of like being like a Palestinian Arab versus a Jordanian Arab versus a Saudi Arab. It was more, I think, religiously oriented, between like Sunni and Shiite maybe. Egypt was a thing, so Egypt existed. Lebanon and Syria were existing entities.
So where does the name Palestine or Palestinian come from?
That comes from the Romans.
And who gave that name to these people?
So the area, that land, that parcel of land, after the Jews were expelled, in the for the last time in the 2nd century, the name of the land was changed to Palestine. It was given by the Romans, in part as a slap in the face to the Jews, but so yeah, that the name Palestine had existed for a long time. That area was known as Palestine, but not like the borders that we know of today weren't like set in stone the way they are now. And in fact, originally, when the British first took over, Palestine included what we now know as Jordan. So it was a much bigger space that we're talking about. And then, before too long, the British were like, you know what, let's just chop that sucker in half and, make a whole other state out of it. But a lot of that space was not like set up they weren't clearly delineated kind of national lines the way there are now.
You said the last time that the Jews were officially in Palestine, or that land was the second century, so they've been out for almost 2,000 years.
I mean, there were Jews in that land throughout, but very, very small numbers and kind of isolated to a couple of locations. So, it wasn't like 100% free of Jews, but essentially after 135, the vast majority of the Jews were gone. There were little communities in Jerusalem, a little community, especially once you start getting into like the more middle-aged time. There's a community that kind of emerged in Sfat around like the mystical tradition. So you have little pockets here and there, but there was no sense of like a real kind of like a Jewish community in Palestine. Like that just wasn't really a thing.
I have a question from over here.
Okay.
Rabbi, what preempted the Brits and the French? Where did that all come from? That they decided that they were going to be the guys that were going to split up the Middle East.
After World War I, when they defeated the Turks, they controlled that space, and they decided, okay, it was almost like a little bartering. It's like, okay, well, if you want Syria, then we get Palestine. Okay, well, if you get Palestine, then we get Lebanon. Okay, well, if you get they basically sat down on a map and said, okay, we're going to take this and this and this. You get this and this and this, and everyone goes home unhappy.
And where does Transjordan fall into all of that?
So Transjordan was split off from the kind of larger, the greater Palestine. Originally, it was what we know as the land of Israel and the country of Jordan were just one entity.
Right.
And the British split it up. I don't know the details, a lot of the details behind that split. I believe that it was done to curry favor with the Hashemites, who were a very powerful family in that area, and it was Britain's attempt to kind of gain an ally in the Arab world by basically giving them their own. It was, I think it was intended almost as like a puppet country, but didn't work out so well.
I have a question also here. I just read a book by a guy named Shumsky it's called Beyond the Nation State, and he goes through the major Zionist thinkers in the early 20th century, including Herzl and Pinsker and Jabotinsky, and even Ben-Gurion. And he says that their theory of Zionism was more of a binational state than a single nation state, that we would, it was the idea basically that it sort of came out of the Jewish experience in Europe, that each nationality would have autonomy over their own area within the empire, like Russia or Germany. And they transferred that same idea to going back to our homeland in the Middle East, in what we call Israel and they call Palestine, and that our relationship to the Arabs would be similar, where there was even a quote from Ben-Gurion that says, it doesn't matter if we're the minority and they're the majority, or they're the majority and we're the minority, we each should have autonomy to within the nation state. There's a difference between a nation state and a nationality. Have you read about that, and what do you think about that?
I mean, I think there were among a lot of the Zionist thinkers kind of I think in hindsight, what is a naive hope that there could be some sort of shared experience, not a shared nation necessarily, but I think that those thoughts were dispelled pretty quickly once people were on the ground. And once they started seeing the kind of responses that the Arab community had to the Jewish presence, I think the idea of a shared state dissipated pretty quickly, because it became clear pretty soon that it just wasn't a functional option. That there were just two, that the Arabs showed no interest in that at all, but also a growing understanding that if the Jews wanted a home of their own where they could do their thing and feel safe and kind of run their own affairs, that they needed to create something that was predominantly Jewish. I mean, I think they were open to a lot of different, we'll see as we go on, they were open to a variety of different partition plans. So I don't think there was necessarily a sense from the jump that they needed to take over the entirety of the space. But I think there was a sense that grew pretty quickly that, there's not a lot of opportunity for cooperation.
Isn't the residual of that theory existing in the state of Israel today, where 20% or more than 20% of the population is Palestinian, and they are functioning members of society, including particularly the medical and the health professions?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the Zionists wanted, there wasn't any, so I'm going to kind of put this, it's kind of like a yes, but. So the Zionists didn't have an issue with the idea of Arabs living under Jewish rule, so to speak. But, and we'll see this when we talk about the 48 war, there was also a both spoken and unspoken desire to kind of have as few Arabs in the Jewish Israel as possible. Those who did stay, those who were there was an understanding that they would, be granted equal rights and be treated fairly and everything else. There was never, I never have seen anything that gave a sense that the Zionists were interested in like subjugating the Arabs. But I think to imagine that an Arab population was something that they wanted or kind of were looking for, I think that's stretching it. I think it was at a certain point just kind of an acknowledgement of the reality, and also like the way the 47 partition plan was laid out, it created a situation in which there were Arabs living in these spaces that came under Jewish control. I think if everyone had been willing to work together and compromise, they may have been able to come up with something different. But because it was imposed upon them, everyone kind of had to just deal with what was instead of what they would have liked to have been. Yes.
You had commented.
Erwin, could you cite that book for us? Just put it in the chat, the title of that book.
So.
Yes, I'll put it in the chat.
The name Palestine was given by the Romans, sort of a slap in the face of the Jews. I think I've been told that it came actually from Philistines, which was the land where the Philistines had lived, which was before the.
Yeah.
Jews.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true, and part of why it was considered, insult, it was intentional in its, because the Israelites and the Philistines didn't exactly have the best relationships going back, so yeah. All right, I want to keep us rolling here because there's still a good bit of stuff that I want us to get to. So I talked about the Jaffa riots, and then we have kind of this period of calm, and then in 1929 we have kind of another riot, for lack of a better term, uprising, depending on what you want to call it. And this one kind of was something that built up over a short period of time. So it started actually the riot itself happened in 1929. In September of 1928, on Erev Yom Kippur, so Jews were praying at the Kotel, and they had a machitza up, the divider between men and women, and the Muslim authorities who kind of oversaw that area, the whole area of what we know as the Temple Mount, thought that violated the agreement that they had come to, thought that that constituted a step too far, and so on Erev Yom Kippur, they had the police come in and forcibly remove the machitza as well as the people who were there. So that kind of starts the ball rolling in this case. And the issue of the Kotel, the Temple Mount, Al Haram al Sharif, Dome of the Rock as it's called, like that's been a point of contention against basically since the beginning and continues to be one. It also has served for a century at this point as basically as an easy way to get people on both sides riled up. In the early times, actually not even like still to this day, groups like Hamas or Hezbollah who identify themselves as being Muslim. I beg to differ, but will kind of create fabricate threats against the Dome of the Rock, that the Jews are going to try and take it over. And then again, that's been happening for a century. The idea that the Jews are going to come and they're going to blow up the Dome of the Rock. They're going to take over the Temple Mount. It's a desecration of Islam. I mean, that has been something that's been used for 100 years to get people riled up. And then on the flip side, Jews have done the same thing at various points of using the Temple Mount as a rallying cry or a way to kind of get certain elements agitated, let's say, as happens here, because in August of 1929, 6,000 Jews march in Tel Aviv chanting, "The wall is ours." And the next day, hundreds of Jews, including many from the extremist group Beitar, demonstrated at the Kotel. Many of the demonstrators were carrying batons, not like sparkly twirly batons, but like whack you in the head batons. Maybe they were sparkly twirly too, I don't know. Probably not though. And then kind of in response to this, on August 16th of 1929, Arab demonstrators marched out of the temple compound to the Kotel and burned books, and as well as a bunch of the notes left in the cracks of the Kotel. August 23rd, so a week later, several thousand rioters came out of the Al Haram al Sharif compound, the Dome of the Rock compound, and attacked Jewish pedestrians and shops, and this led to a much wider spread attack against the Jews of Palestine. The two areas that were hardest hit were Tzfat and Hebron, in part because those were Orthodox enclaves, and so they were not, they just didn't have the means or really the inclination towards self-defense. They didn't attack the towns that were going to be fortified. They didn't attack the towns that they knew there were going to be people who would fight back. They attacked the towns where there were people who were likely not going to fight back. Now, one thing that, in a pinprick of light in a dark time, apparently, there are a lot of stories from Hebron of Arabs hiding their Jewish neighbors and protecting their Jewish neighbors so that they wouldn't get, beaten or killed by these mobs. So, while there weren't really, we don't see a lot of examples of Arab-Jewish cooperation on kind of a larger scale. That doesn't mean that there weren't things that were happening kind of interpersonal, house to house, town to town kind of things. So, the Hebron riots, as they're known, lead us into the 1930s. And this is where, again, we can kind of see that things are incrementally ramping up. This isn't something that went from 0 to 100. This is something where it starts off, okay, there's a little tension builds and it builds and it builds. And then there's this outburst and that outburst. And each time it kind of, it gets harder and harder for there to be any sort of common ground, any opportunities for real cooperation, because, through these incidents, both sides are developing this animosity towards the other. And it's an animosity that there's nothing really being done. And maybe there wasn't any, a lot of the sources just kind of say like, there wasn't really anything anyone could do because both sides are kind of entrenched in their national aspirations. And those national aspirations were in direct conflict with each other. And so at a certain point, both sides started to take it's us or them approach to things, which, it might be easy for us to kind of look back and say, well, there were why couldn't they cooperate? Why couldn't they do this? There are so many other ways they could have handled this. But when you're in the midst of it, and especially when you're two groups of people that have, not exactly experienced a lot of love in the rest of the world, when you have an opportunity to create something for yourself, what you think could be a safe place for you and your crew, you're not gonna bend on that very easily. So in the 30s, on the international scene, of course, we have the emergence of the Nazis. In 1933, we have kind of dictators in Italy and Japan, and kind of growing military strength in those countries, and increasing examples of acts of aggression. Probably the biggest thing that happens in the 30s is what's known as the Arab Revolt, or the Great Palestinian Revolt, which took place from 1936 to 1939. This is like the next kind of big moment between the growing Zionist entity and the Arab population of Palestine. The goal of this was, and this was not a revolt in the way we normally think of it, it was more a kind of a large scale strike, a work stoppage. There were confrontations between the Arabs and Jews and Arabs and British, but it wasn't kind of like the violent revolt that we might imagine. And the goal was to undo Balfour, the Balfour Declaration, stop Jewish immigration, and halt land sales to Jews. That was the stated goal of these various activities that the Palestinian Arabs engaged in. Unfortunately for them, and fortunately for the Jews, in many cases, it had the opposite effect of what they were hoping for. So, dock workers in Haifa who stopped showing up to work, a lot of times Jews came in and took their place because they're like, okay, well, hey, job, hooray. But also it led to the opening of a port in Tel Aviv, So, instead of being obligated to use a port in Haifa or a port in Jaffa, now there's a port in Tel Aviv that the Jews really have control over. And that helps in terms of commerce, it helps in terms of immigration. It opens up a lot of things. Not just around the ports, but in a lot of different areas. When there were work stoppages, the Jews would step in and take those positions because they were there. And the people who were running the companies or whatever, to them, like, they couldn't care less. Like, as long as the work's getting done, it doesn't matter whether it's Jews or Arabs doing it, things got to happen. We also see the emergence of what were called tower and stockade settlements. This was also in response to kind of what they saw happen in 1921 and 1929 with the different riots. So these tower and stockade settlements is basically small groups of people would go to an area of land that had been designated for Jewish settlement, and they would set up like a tower and like a perimeter, because their first, like the thing they had to prioritize above all else was defense. And so by making their very first act one of setting up kind of a defense perimeter and a tower from which they could, keep track of what's going on, shoot people if they needed to, because that was a thing that happened. And I think like 50 of these were set up over the course of this 3-year period. And a lot of these turned into the kibbutzim, the moshavas, and the towns that exist to this day. But the way they went about it, kind of prioritizing defense over all else, allowed them to kind of establish themselves and then start actually building the rest of the town and infrastructure and everything else. There was a lot of infighting among the Palestinian Arabs at the time. The numbers vary depending on who's saying them, but I've seen anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 Palestinian Arabs were killed during this 3-year period. Some by the Jews, more by the British, and from most of the accounts that I've read, a lot from other Palestinians. Either people were viewed as traitors, there was family beef that was hashed out in that kind of way. But there was a lot of infighting, which made it more difficult for them to kind of, that was always one of the big differences between the Zionists and the Palestinian Arabs, is that the Zionists really, up until the late 30s, really functioned as a single entity. Like everyone was on the same page, everyone was moving in the same direction, like everyone was on the same program. It was unified and cohesive, and everyone faced the same direction. Late 30s, we start to see with like the Irgun and some of that, we get a little bit of splintering, but even then, like that was a small splinter, and the vast majority were still kind of part of this. We are in this together, we are working together, we are all moving towards this one goal. Whereas among the Palestinians, you just didn't have that. You had sometimes different groups competing for power, for authority, for prestige. Different groups who had different ideas about what an Arab Palestine should look like. I'm quite certain that the British and Jewish intelligence apparati were also probably played a role in sowing some discord among the various groups. A little bit of divide and conquer. And maybe the most important thing that happened during this period, during this 1936 to 1939, is really the kind of elevating of the Haganah, the Israel's defense force before it was the Israeli Defense Force. And part of this is because the British decided that, okay, we can't deal with this. We can't deal with the Arabs on our own. We need help. Let's ask the Jews. They'll be happy to help us. And what ended up happening is it gave the Jews, a lot of like 20,000 Jewish soldiers or Jewish, Haganah members had the opportunity to train like in daylight, without having to hide it, with like British police, British special forces, British military. And so that training, these are all the people who, 10, 15 years later are going to be integral in the success of 1948.
That would be Wingate.
Wingate was one of the big ones. Yeah. So Wingate was a British officer who led a group called the Special Night Squads. And they were basically they were a commando force, and they did they specialized in ambushes. And he taught this group a lot of tactics that continue to be used by the IDF. But it gave them a significant leg up in terms of skill, experience, all of which would work toward their benefit as things went on. So while this was going on, the Arab revolt, the 36 to 39 revolt, the Yishuv, the official body of Zionists, had a policy of no revenge actions, or at least no revenge killings. It's interesting, especially again, we see these things from the 30s, and they resonate so much today. It's both kind of interesting, but kind of a little bit sad that this is still something that. But so this is the underlying this approach. This is not wanting to do revenge stuff. Underlying this approach was the desire to avoid harming innocent people, and the belief that the Yishuv could unite only behind moral actions. So this sense of we have to do it right. Like we have to walk the straight and narrow. We have to follow all the rules, because that's the only way people are going to support us and get behind us. And that they didn't just mean the British or whoever else. They also meant that other Jews. I mean, we have a strong and well-established moral code, and the members of the Yishuv, even as many of them have kind of discarded any religious Judaism, the ethics were still an important part of who they were and how they viewed themselves. Like they viewed themselves as righteous, and they believed that they could only kind of hold the moral high ground if they used restraint, kind of played by the rules, so on and so forth. However, that wasn't everybody. I mentioned the Irgun before. That was kind of a splinter organization led by Zev Jabotinsky initially, and then Menachem Begin afterwards. They did not hold by the same code. They very much had an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth approach to things, and went about targeting Arab civilians in markets, on public transportation, in a variety of different spaces. So, lest we think that the entirety of the Zionist enterprise was, on the moral high ground, there was some sketchiness going on among our folks as well. How are we doing on time? Okay, 7:26. So we got just a couple more things I want to get to, and then we'll pick up with the 48 war next time. So yeah, next time is going to be like all wars all the time. So fun, I guess. So in 1937, we have what's known as the Peel Commission, and this is, I think, really the first legitimate attempt to partition the land. So they recommend, Peel Commission comes from England. They schlep all over the land. They see what's what, and they say, okay, it is clear to us that this is not, everyone being together is not working. So let's split. You go to your corner, you go to your corner. Everyone has a 30-year timeout, and then we'll revisit. But it's, so they recommended 2 states be established side by side within the land of Israel. The Jewish state would have been allocated 17% of the territory, 17% of the territory. The Arab state would have been the rest of it, other than Jerusalem and its kind of outskirts, which would have remained under British control. So the Zionists kind of begrudgingly agreed to this. They were like, yeah, okay, well, we don't love it. We got some questions about these borders that you're proposing, but fine, whatever, like we can work with this. And the Palestinian Arab leadership rejected it out of hand. And actually, this sparked a renewal of the revolt against the British. And so a quote kind of about this to kind of give a sense of what the Arab mindset was. The Arabs rejected the partition plan because it meant the creation of a Jewish state on pure Arab land, whose owners only had the right to establish a modern state thereon, and in which the Jews would be represented and their rights preserved. So from the Arab perspective, they were saying, look, this is our space. Like, you've come to our space, but this is still our space. We are the vast majority. So if there's going to be a state, fine, it'll be an Arab state. Y'all can live here and hang out. We won't mess with you. But, no, you don't get to have your own place because this is our place. Needless to say, the Peel Commission didn't really amount to much. And things kind of continued about. And then, a couple of years later, we get what's known as the McDonald White Paper. That's M-A-C Donald, not M-C Donald, just in case anyone's curious. So what's really interesting about the McDonald White Paper is one, so the Zionists viewed it as an absolute betrayal by the British. And I'll get into like the details of it here in a second. But just the way the Zionists and the Arabs kind of view this is really fascinating, not only just in the general attitude towards it, but in how they read the actual document itself. So there's a few pieces of this that I just want to share because it's, I think they're worth knowing. So basically this was essentially a revisiting of the Balfour Declaration, and an attempt by the British, most view it as an attempt by the British to pacify the Arab community in order to stop the work, the striking and the revolting that had been going on for, on and off for 3 years. So here's a couple, these are direct quotes from the white paper. If you want to look it up online, it's easy to find. It's from 1939. So the independent state should be one in which Arabs and Jews share government in such a way as to ensure that the essential interests of each community are safeguarded. Seems reasonable enough. Unless you're a Jew or an Arab who wants the country for yourself. So they talk about like a 10-year transition period during which, like the infrastructures of government and everything else could be set up. Both sections of the population will have an opportunity to participate in the machinery of government, and the process will be carried on whether or not they both avail themselves of it, which is I feel like a very parental kind of line. It's like, this is happening. If you would like to participate, you're welcome to, but we're not going to force you to. Then in terms of like details about the government, Arab and Jewish representatives will be invited to serve as heads of departments approximately in proportion to their respective populations. That was a big sticking point for the Zionists because they understood that they were a small fraction of the population. And so that would mean that they would not have had a lot of control of a government set up in this way. The biggest point of contention and the biggest point of, I think, misunderstanding from both sides involved immigration. So after, in the little preamble to the actual official statements, there's a lot about, originally the idea, the kind of British policy of immigration of Jews to Palestine was, it was dependent on kind of the economic situation of the Jewish community in Palestine. So essentially, if the community can afford to, how many people can the community afford to support? And that's how many people are allowed to come. Now there was also a lot of illegal immigration going on, which is a whole, which was a whole other issue for the British and the Arabs both. But in this white paper, it says, and remember, this is 1939, right? So like, we are past Kristallnacht, we are like well into the Nazi regime and everything that, that comes with it. So, keeping in mind what the mindset, what the kind of thought process, the attitude, the feelings of the Jewish community in both in the land of Israel and in Europe would have been at this point. So the wording in the text is the original wording is very vague. So it says, from the beginning of April of this year, some 75,000 immigrants over the next 5 years would be allowed to come Jewish immigrants would be allowed to come to Palestine. So if you just leave it at that, that's okay. Well, what is that? Is that 75,000 per year? Is that 75,000 total? What does that mean? They do specify for each of the next 5 years, a quota of 10,000 Jewish immigrants will be allowed on the understanding that a shortage 1 year may be added to the quotas for subsequent years. So essentially 10,000 people per year. In addition to 25,000 refugees will be admitted as soon as possible, as soon as it can be confirmed that adequate provision for their maintenance is ensured, special consideration to children and dependents. So what it meant is over 5 years, 75,000 people total, which sounds like a lot until you think of the fact that there are, 13 million Jews living in Europe. And then here's the real kicker. After the period of 5 years, no further Jewish immigration will be permitted unless the Arabs of Palestine are prepared to acquiesce in it. And that was where the Zionists were like, whoa, wait a second. This is not okay. The idea that it was 75,000 and then that's it, unless you get permission from the Arabs, like that was a non-starter for the Jews. There's also stuff about land ownership and, severely limiting how much land Jews could buy, put control over deciding whether Jews could or could not buy land, I think in the hands of the British as opposed to anybody else. So that, the Jewish perspective of this was it was a completely pro-Arab document. And we can see why. Like it felt like a betrayal, it felt like a slap in the face, particularly given what was going on in Europe at the time. So the way the Jews read it is that within 10 years, there would be an Arab state in Palestine with a Jewish majority or Jewish minority, which is a reasonable reading of it. Jewish immigration would be limited to 75,000 over the next 5 years. Again, pretty reasonable. And then, the issues of land transfer. But one thing that was really interesting is the Palestinian perspective. And so the Palestinian Arabs viewed this as a victory brought about by the 1936 revolt. So they viewed the white paper as a victory. So, we can see why the Jews would have been sketchy about it. But what's interesting is that when they read it, they read it as 75,000 a year for the next 5 years. And that they were uncomfortable with the idea of any possibility of further land transfers to the Jews. And so both sides were like, no thanks, we're not interested. Like both sides, even though the Palestinians viewed it as a victory, they still rejected it they said, no, this is not something that we want to abide by. And then, of course, as we get into the late 30s and into the 40s, we have the emergence of World War II. We all kind of, I don't need to get into the details about that, but there is one thing that I wanted to point out about this, which sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, but I think is really important in understanding, particularly like post-Holocaust, the Jewish attitude towards the Arabs in general, but Arabs in Palestine in particular, which is that the Arabs were active supporters of the Axis. They were active supporters of the Nazis. And for them, it was, well, we hate the British and they hate the British, so we're going to go with them. It wasn't necessarily born out of anti-Semitism. It wasn't necessarily born out of anything like that. It was just, you know, kind of the
enemy of my enemy.
right, the enemy of
Yeah.
my enemy is my friend. And so, you know, but what's really interesting, and so I wanted to share a couple of books that I think are, you know, if you want to kind of really dig deep into this period of time, a couple of books that I think are worth checking out. One is this one. It's called One Palestine Complete, Jews and Arabs Under the British Mandate. Where is it? There we go. By Tom Segal. But I also wanted to share this one. So this is a book called Side by Side, Parallel Histories of Israel and Palestine. And what this is, it is just what it says. It is the history of this area on one page, like basically on one side, you have it as written by an Israeli historian. And on the other side, you have it written by a Palestinian historian. And so as you go through it, you can see the different perspectives. You can see, and it's really fascinating. Just it's also really hard to read, at least for me, because it requires a real conscious kind of suspending of one's own thoughts, feelings, experiences. Like, to read the Palestinian side of it, like, you really have to be willing to put yourself aside for a moment and really just try and take it as it is, because basically every paragraph, I'm like, that's not what happened. But in order, like, if we're really going to try and understand why things are the way they are, like, we have to be willing to explore the Palestinian perspective on these things, because, you know, even if we read it and think like, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense, or I don't agree with that, or whatever, like I said at the beginning, knowing it at least can maybe help us figure out, okay, how did the Palestinians, as we know them today, how did they get from point A to point B in terms of their understanding of this conflict, in terms of their view of Jews and Israel? Like, how did they get here? And so
Say
one thing
the title of the book again.
the title of the book is Side by Side. There it is.
Okay, Side by Side. Okay.
Yeah, it's challenging. It is like I said, it is a challenging book to work through, but really, really interesting. But I wanted to show this because one of the things that I was really surprised by and thought was really interesting is that in the Palestinian piece about World War II, there is no mention of allegiance with the Nazis, like, not a word.
Yeah.
I will tell you what, from the Palestinian perspective. So this is a direct quote from this book about that period of time. Talking about the siege and tight grip imposed by the British and their French allies who persecuted the Palestinians in Syria and Lebanon. Britain outlawed the Arab Higher Committee, banned its activities, and for 8 years persecuted its leaders who were arrested or went into hiding or exile. But there is at no point does the Palestinian historian say, like, point out that maybe this was happening because of their outward allegiance with the Nazis and the Axis, which I found really surprising, first of all, but really interesting. And again, I think it speaks to the general perspective. And one thing, you know, having kind of gone through a lot of this for a long time, and, you know, now we're getting a little meta because this is like the history of history, right? So for a long time, the histories of Israel were very celebratory. There was a lot of like, we are, we're so good, we're so great, like we are the righteous, we are the right, we are the good guys. And then in the kind of late 90s, mid to late 90s, you get this group of what were called the new historians. And they kind of went back, and part of it was because there were all these documents, all this information that had been sealed and was suddenly available. Because I think there was like a 50-year lock on it, basically. And when those 50 years were up, all of a sudden, all this information became available. So all these historians were like sifting through all these primary documents and everything else. And the histories that they wrote were much more honest, but much more critical. Because, Israel, like any other place, is not perfect and has made mistakes and has done things that maybe they shouldn't have done. And so, these new historians were kind of like, okay, we messed up here. And that's okay, because like that's something that happens sometimes. But here's here's as close to the truth as we can get to what how Israel became what it is today. And I kind of wonder, based on what I've seen in this book at least, if the Palestinian community isn't there yet. Because it requires a certain level of comfort to be willing to like look at oneself or look at one's situation that kind of critically. And I think for the Palestinians, like they're not at a place where they can do that yet, intellectually or whatever the case may be, because thus far in the stuff that I've looked at, I haven't found any example where the Palestinian historian kind of acknowledges any wrongdoing by the Palestinian Arabs at any point. And so, it's just kind of an interesting thought exercise to wonder, okay, what does that say about the state of kind of, Palestinian historians in this, in this time? And will we get to a place at some point where you have kind of the new historians of the history of Palestine and the Palestinians? And clearly I don't know, because I haven't learned how to look into the future yet. Yeah.
History is written by the winners. So as long as the Arab states are what they are and the Palestinians are who they are, you're not going to see them accept that.
I don't think that's necessarily true anymore. I think for a long, long time, you're right, history is written by the winners. But I do think that, with all the access people have to all the different ways people have to get their ideas out into the kind of public sphere, I don't necessarily know if I agree that is still the case. I think we have a different problem now, which is that history is written by anybody who wants to write history, and without any sense of like, and so like now the challenge becomes, okay, we've got 1,000 different versions. How do we know which one is how do we just determine which one is more legit than the other? But your point about history being written by the winners generally has been very true. My favorite example of that is I have a weird fascination with Genghis Khan. And there's a great, I don't remember the name of the book, but there's a great book about him that's like written kind of in a more, it's written about him by someone who wasn't being, conquered by him, because all the stuff for a long time was always written by the people who he had conquered. And so, they're going to have a little bit of a dicey attitude towards him, but he was a fascinating character. But I digress. So All right, it is 7:47. I've kept everyone later than the agreed upon time, so I'll chet shachatani. But we'll be here again next week. We'll start with the 48 war. If you have questions or anything, tonight I have to bolt pretty quickly, but you can email me. If you want to write down my email address, you can. It's scottsegal18@gmail.com. So you can email me if you have questions or things. You get home and you're like, oh, wait a second, what about this and this and this? Hit me up. I'm happy to talk about it. If over time, if either now or like after all these sessions are done, and this goes for you fine folks on Zoom also. If people want to get together and chat some more about it, I think you can tell, like, I love talking about this. Like, this is my jam right here. And if after this is all done, if people wanted to do a real like deep dive into any stuff, that's certainly something I'd be open to working out. So,
I do.
oh, great. So, thank you all so much for being here. For the people on Zoom, thank you guys so much for looking at you. And next week, same bat time, same bat channel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Are you gonna record all of these?
Yeah, they're all going to be
I
recorded.
can't make